The midday sun pressed hard upon Millstone Junction, burning white against the wide sky and flattening every shadow it touched. Heat shimmered off the rails, bending the air above the dusty tracks. The wooden platform creaked under the shifting weight of townsfolk gathered shoulder to shoulder beneath the station's awning. Men tugged at their collars, sweat streaking down weathered faces. Women fanned themselves with folded papers, the air thick with dust and gossip. Children craned their necks, listening. From the far distance came the long, mournful cry of a steam whistle, carried thin across the prairie. The train from the east was arriving, and with it the bride. Steel wheels clattered closer, louder, shaking the earth beneath worn boots. A plume of smoke curled skyward, black against the bright sun. The engine groaned to a halt, the hiss of steam cutting through the restless murmur of the crowd. From the second passenger car, a woman stepped down. Margaret Doyle. She carried only a carpet bag, its handle worn thin, her knuckles white where she gripped it. Her figure was wrapped in a pale blue dress, simple but carefully pressed, though the long journey had dulled its edges with dust. Draped across her face was a heavy veil of cream fabric, fastened tightly beneath her chin. Behind it, her heart beat against her ribs like hooves across dry earth. Beneath the veil, pain lingered. The left side of her face carried an old scar, running from cheekbone to jawline, carved there by a fire long ago. She had learned to live with the mark, but she had never learned to escape it. Worse still was the burden of her name. Margaret Doyle, daughter of Samuel Doyle, the man hanged for treason in the final year of the war. That truth clung to her as tightly as the scar, and heavier still. As her boots struck the platform, voices rose around her like the drone of flies. Is that her? Doyle's girl. From Virginia, I heard. Hiding something under that veil. Mark my words. The air thickened with judgment. Maggie's grip on her bag tightened until her fingers ached. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind 100 times. She would step down, gather herself, and walk forward with grace. She would lift her veil, reveal herself, and Richard Hale, the man who had promised marriage, would smile with warmth, or at least with decency. He stood now at the far end of the platform, tall, still, composed. His suit was a rich brown, neat and pressed. A silver chain glinted at his vest, leading to the pocket watch he wore with pride. His black hat cast a shadow over eyes that watched her, unreadable. His beard was trimmed, his boots polished. Everything about him radiated control and order. Maggie began to walk. One step, another. The murmur of the crowd sharpened into something harder. A man leaning near the post office spat into the dirt. That's Doyle's girl. The traitor's blood. A woman whispered harshly behind her fan. What kind of man marries the daughter of a turncoat? Richard heard. She could see it in the way his jaw tightened, the thin press of his lips. Yet he said nothing. He did not step forward. He did not offer his hand. Her feet stopped before him. The station fell into silence. Maggie's throat worked, swallowing hard. Her fingers trembled as she lifted them toward her veil. The cloth brushed her chin, her lips, her cheek. The crowd leaned closer, holding its breath. Richard's eyes flicked to the scar. His expression hardened like stone. His voice broke the silence, sharp and final. I cannot marry you. The words struck like a hammer. Maggie froze, the veil half raised. For a heartbeat, the whole station seemed to sway. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Someone whispered, God help her. Richard's eyes did not waver. He took a step back. I will not, he said again, louder this time, the words cold enough to carry. Maggie's hand dropped. Her eyes widened, tears spilling hot and silent beneath the veil. Her knees weakened, folding beneath her until she sank slowly to the platform. Her carpet bag slid from her grasp, thudding against the wood. She clawed at the veil, dragging it back down over her face, desperate to hide. Richard turned without pause, his polished boots clicking against the planks as he walked away. The townsfolk shifted, their curiosity spent, their cruelty lingering. Some shook their heads, pity in their eyes. Others smirked or whispered words sharp enough to cut. Serves her right. Poor thing. No place for a trader's daughter here. One by one, they drifted away, leaving her where she knelt, small and trembling, the dust settling around her. The platform emptied. Wind whistled low across the depot's roof. Maggie sat hollow-eyed on the wooden boards, the weight of her father's name pressing down heavier than ever. Then, from the shadow of the depot's porch, Boots stepped forward. Ethan McGra. He was tall, broad in the shoulders, his clothes plain and worn by trail dust. He carried himself with the stillness of a man who had seen war and survived it, though not unchanged. A faint scar crossed his temple, half hidden beneath dark hair. His hands were rough, but they rested easily at his sides. He wore no hat, no polished boots, no arrogance, just presence. He crouched beside her, slow and careful, as though afraid she might break if touched too harshly. With one finger, he brushed the edge of her veil aside. His voice was quiet, steady, not for the crowd but for her alone. No one ever told you, "You're beautiful." The words startled her. She blinked up through the fabric, meeting his eyes. There was no mockery there, no pity, only honesty. He offered his hand. Not pulling, not demanding, just holding it open. Her fingers shook as they touched his. He steadied her, helped her rise, and without another word led her toward a two-horse wagon waiting at the edge of the road. The ride out of Millstone Junction was silent, the horses' hooves thudding against the packed earth, the town shrinking behind them. Prairie stretched wide and endless, rolling into hills where pine trees gathered thick. At last, they reached a lone log cabin, weathered but strong, smoke curling soft from its chimney. Inside, the air smelled of wood and ash. The cabin was simple, worn but cared for. Ethan pointed to the corner where a bed stood covered in a quilt. "You can rest here tonight," he said. His voice was plain, matter-of-fact. Then he nodded to the hearth. "There's tea if you want it." Maggie sat, her hands folding tightly in her lap. "I won't stay long," she whispered. Ethan gave the faintest shrug. "Didn't think you would." He left her in peace. That night, Maggie lay beneath the quilt, her dress still on, exhaustion dragging her down. The fabric smelled faintly of pine and smoke. She listened to the sounds of the cabin, the creak of wood under boots, the scrape of tools being cleaned, the quiet hush of a chair rocking. No judgment, no questions. Sleep took her, heavy and dreamless. Morning came soft, with bird song outside the window and pale light spilling across the floor. Maggie blinked awake to find a cup of warm water by her bedside. The broken chair in the corner had been mended. The floor swept. On the table lay fresh cloth, a plate of bread and honey. For a long moment, she sat still, unsure if she was dreaming. She found Ethan outside, sleeves rolled, splitting wood in the yard. His brow glistened with sweat. He did not look at her as she approached. "I'll be on my way," she said softly. He nodded once. "You know where the road is." She turned, made it 5 steps down the path, then stopped. On the horizon, dark clouds gathered, thick and fast-moving. A storm was coming. The sky rumbled low with warning. She looked to the road, then back to the cabin. Her feet turned. She walked back. Ethan said nothing, just opened the door as the first drops began to fall. By afternoon, the storm struck. Wind tore through the trees like a living thing. Rain hammered the roof, thunder cracking across the hills. They worked quickly, pulling canvas over windows, tying down the chicken coop, bracing boards against the walls. Maggie's sleeves clung wet to her arms, her hair loose and plastered against her face. Ethan climbed to secure the roof beam while she fought to hold the door closed against the gale. Lightning flashed, white and violent. The storm howled, testing the cabin, testing them both. The storm raged harder, pressing its full weight against the little cabin. The roof groaned as if under a giant's hand. Rain slapped the windows in sheets, rattling the glass. The wind screamed down the chimney, carrying with it the scent of wet pine and earth torn loose. Maggie's hands burned from holding the door, splinters digging into her palms where the wood shuddered with every gust. Her arms shook, but she pressed harder, jaw clenched, refusing to let go. Ethan's voice cut through the roar. "Hold steady." She gritted her teeth. "I'm trying." He braced a beam against the hearth, muscles taut beneath his damp shirt, sleeves rolled high. Lightning cracked again, flooding the room with white for the briefest heartbeat. In that flash, she saw the scar across his temple, sharp and pale against his skin, and realized. He too carried a mark of survival. The storm gave no pause. Wind slammed the door so hard it nearly tore from her grasp. She cried out, her knees buckling, but Ethan was there in an instant. He pressed his body against the door, his shoulder anchoring it shut. His hand brushed hers, steady and firm, keeping her upright. For a moment, they stood together, both breathing hard, the storm battering them like waves against rock. Then the roof beam shifted. A groan deep and low rolled through the rafters. Maggie's eyes snapped upward. The roof! Ethan moved fast, pushing away from the door and grabbing another board. "Stay with it," he shouted. She threw her weight against the wood, fighting the wind alone, her whole body trembling. He climbed the ladder, nailing the board across the frame with heavy, sure strikes. Each hammer blow echoed like a drum against the thunder. Maggie's arms burned. Tears pricked her eyes from the strain, but she refused to let go. Not again, not here. At last, Ethan dropped back down, sweat and rain mingling on his brow. He pulled the bar across the door, and together they stumbled back, breathing ragged. For a moment they only listened. The storm still roared, but the cabin held. The fire snapped defiantly in the hearth, a single warm light against the darkness outside. Maggie's hands trembled as she brushed her wet hair back, her chest rising and falling. She caught Ethan's eyes then. There was no distance in them, no judgment. Only a quiet steadiness, the same that had carried her from the station, the same that now held the cabin upright. Her voice came out in a whisper, barely audible over the rain. "Why are you helping me?" Ethan's jaw flexed. He set the hammer down, his eyes fixed on the flames. "Because you needed it." "That simple?" she asked, her voice cracking. He looked at her then, really looked, and for the first time she didn't flinch under someone's gaze. His expression was not pity, not scorn. It was something harder but kinder. "That simple," he said. A silence settled between them, deep and strangely calm, even as the storm raged outside. For the first time in years, Maggie did not feel entirely alone. Hours passed. The storm slowly began to tire, its fury rolling eastward into the hills. Rain softened. The thunder grew distant. The wind settled into sighs against the walls. Exhaustion pulled at Maggie's limbs. She sank into the chair by the fire, her veil heavy and damp, clinging to her skin. With shaking hands, she lifted it away, letting it fall to her lap. The scar lay bare in the firelight, no fabric left to hide it. She half expected Ethan to look away, the way Richard had, the way the town always did. Instead, Ethan leaned forward, elbows on his knees, eyes steady on hers. "You fought that storm harder than anyone I've seen," he said quietly. "Scar or no scar, I reckon that makes you stronger than most." Her throat tightened. She lowered her gaze, tears slipping down her cheeks. Tears not of shame this time, but of something else. Relief. The cabin crackled with the sound of burning pine. The storm passed, but something else remained, alive and unshaken, between them. "Roof beam." Ethan's voice was sharp, urgent. The wood groaned, long and deep, then splintered with a violent crack. Maggie's instincts moved faster than thought. She grabbed his arm and yanked. They tumbled backward together just as the beam gave way, crashing down where Ethan had been standing a heartbeat earlier. The sound was deafening. Dust and fragments of pine burst into the air, the storm's howl rushing in through the gap above. For a moment, time held its breath. Then silence fell inside the cabin, broken only by the wild pounding of rain and wind outside. They lay sprawled side by side on the rough floorboards, chests heaving, hearts hammering like drums in their ribs. Maggie's veil had slipped, clinging wet to her face, but she didn't reach for it. She turned, eyes wide in the dim light, searching his. "You all right?" Ethan's voice was rough, concerned. She swallowed, her throat dry despite the storm. "Ah, yes." Then, with a shaky breath, "You! I will be," he said, and there was a flicker of something, wry, almost a smile, before he pushed himself slowly up, grimacing at the weight of exhaustion. He extended his hand, strong and steady, palm open. Maggie hesitated for just a heartbeat before placing hers in it. His grasp was warm, grounding, pulling her back from the edge of panic. They sat together against the wall, shoulder to shoulder, while rain poured through the broken roof, dripping into growing puddles on the floorboards. Maggie shivered, cold seeping into her bones. Ethan shrugged off his coat and placed it over her shoulders without a word. He didn't ask about her scar. He didn't glance away from it either. His silence was not avoidance, it was acceptance. And for the first time in years, Maggie felt something unexpected. She felt needed. The days after the storm unfolded with a strange new rhythm. Something subtle shifted between them, like seeds stirring beneath thawed soil. Inside the cabin, Maggie no longer kept her veil over her face. At first, it was necessity. The fabric was damp, stiff, and heavy. But soon she realized she didn't need it here. Not with him. When she stepped outside, she still pulled it over her scar, habit too deeply cut to abandon. But within those wooden walls, she let the scar breathe. And Ethan never stared. He never looked away either. His eyes found hers when he spoke, and when they lingered on her cheek, it was not with pity but with a kind of quiet normalcy, as if the mark were no more shocking than a freckle. Their days filled with small labors that slowly stitched them together. Maggie boiled water while Ethan repaired the gate. Together, they mended fences under the morning sun, her hands raw but steady, his patience guiding her where she faltered. She showed him how to churn butter from cream, laughing softly when the task splattered both of them. He taught her how to brace a loose beam, hammering nails by feel as much as instinct. Evenings were quiet. They shared meals by the fire, silence as much a comfort as conversation. Sometimes Ethan told stories, short, blunt, almost reluctant, but real. Maggie listened, holding each word like a fragile gift. One night, as the kettle hissed and the wind sighed against the shutters, Ethan spoke without looking at her. His eyes were on the flames. "My brother died in the last week of the war. Cannon fire outside Franklin." His jaw tightened. "He was 20. I held what was left of him, buried him myself." The crackle of fire filled the long pause. Maggie's hands folded in her lap, her head bowed. Her voice was low, barely above a whisper. "I am sorry." Ethan nodded once. "When it ended, I rode home. But there was no home. Town burned. Mother gone. Land taken. So I kept riding." The words hung heavy, but before the silence could swallow them, Maggie spoke, her voice softer than the whistle of the kettle. "My father was hanged outside Richmond. They said he passed messages to the Confederacy. Maybe he did. He never told me. I was 12. Her eyes glistened. "We were forced out of town. My mother died 2 winters later. I was passed from one relative to another. No one wanted a traitor's daughter." Ethan turned to her then, his gaze steady. He didn't speak, but he didn't need to. The silence between them was full, not empty. Full of understanding. Full of grief carried and grief shared. 2 days later, Ethan invited her into town. Supplies were running low. Maggie hesitated at first, her hand hovering over the veil folded neatly on the table. But habit won out. She tied it in place, fabric falling to hide her cheek. At the general store, she kept her head down as she filled a small sack with beans and flour. Ethan moved between the aisles, wordless, efficient. But outside, voices carried sharp as broken glass. 2 men leaned against the railing, smirking. "Guess Hale didn't want her," one drawled. The other chuckled. "McGRA probably plans to sell her instead. Might fetch a coin or 2, with a sack over her head." Maggie froze, her fingers trembling against the bag of beans. Shame rose hot in her chest, crawling up her throat until she could hardly breathe. Ethan heard. She saw it in the stiff line of his shoulders, the way his jaw flexed. But he said nothing. He only took the sack from her hands, calm and steady, and walked her back to the wagon. The ride home was silent. Maggie stared at her lap, her scar burning beneath the veil, the men's laughter echoing in her skull. That night, lying beneath the pine-scented quilt, she touched the rough line of her cheek. Her chest ached with one sharp question. How long could kindness last before pity turned cruel? 3 days later, outside the saloon, the answer came. A drunk leaned on the rail, voice raised for all to hear. That one keeps a branded woman in his bed. Or is he selling her by weight? Maggie's heart plummeted. Heat rushed to her face. Her hands trembled at her sides, her breath coming shallow. Ethan turned. Slowly, deliberately. He stepped forward, his height casting the drunk in shadow. He didn't swing his fist. He didn't shout. Instead, he raised one hand, palm out, voice like iron. She is kinder, stronger, and more decent than anyone in this town. Speak her name again, and I will not be this gentle. The man's grin faltered. His eyes darted to the crowd, searching for support that wasn't there. He muttered and stepped back, shrinking into the doorway. Ethan turned, calm as before, and walked away. Word spread quickly. By the next morning, the story had already stretched across Millstone Junction. At the bakery, women whispered behind their aprons. At the blacksmith's, hammers paused mid-strike as the tale was retold. Some laughed, some frowned, some muttered about Ethan McGerry's nerve, but no one denied what had happened. The war-scarred rancher had stood in the middle of Main Street and defended Margaret Doyle, the trader's daughter, the veiled girl, before them all. Maggie felt it the moment she stepped outside the cabin days later. The air in town had shifted. Not softened, not warm, but altered. The stares still came, but they carried something new. Wariness, respect, and a quiet warning. This woman was no longer unprotected. At first, Maggie kept her head low, veil drawn tight, heart thudding like a drum as she walked beside Ethan. The memory of the drunk's words still stung, her shame a shadow clinging close. Yet when she heard whispers now, they were different. McGerry's got grit, I'll say that. Stood up for her like she was worth 10 of us. Well, maybe she is. The change unsettled her. Mercy born of fear was no mercy at all, she thought. And yet, when Ethan handed her down from the wagon, his palm steady beneath hers, she noticed something new. Her shame did not burn quite so hot. Life in the cabin pressed forward with the steady rhythm of survival. Days filled with labor. Chopping wood, patching leaks, tending chickens, grinding corn. The scar on her cheek no longer hid under fabric when she moved through the cabin. Veil hung untouched on its peg by the door. One evening, as twilight painted the prairie in violet and gold, Ethan and Maggie sat outside, supper bowls balanced in their laps. The air smelled of damp grass and pine smoke. Crickets sang low. Maggie watched the horizon, silent, until her voice came soft, almost a whisper. I used to dream, she said, that I would step off that train and be someone new. A bride, a wife, no longer a Doyle. She paused, throat tight. Instead, the veil was torn, and the name still clings. Ethan's gaze stayed fixed on the distance, steady and unhurried. A name's just a shadow, he said finally. A shadow can't plow a field, can't hold a child, can't warm a house. It only follows until you stop fearing it. Maggie blinked, his words sinking into her chest like water into parched earth. She had lived so long under the weight of her father's choices that she'd forgotten her own. But not all in Millstone Junction were ready to let the past die. A week later, when she ventured into town alone for the first time, whispers swelled around her like storm clouds. She felt them prickling the back of her neck as she crossed the boardwalk. Veil lifted just enough for her to see her steps. At the mercantile, an older woman leaned close to another. Scarred face or not, she'll bring ruin if McGerry keeps her. Trader's blood runs deep, the other agreed. Maggie's hands trembled as she counted coins onto the counter. Shame threatened to smother her again, heavy and choking. But when she stepped outside, Ethan was waiting. His presence solid as oak, his horse tied to the post. He said nothing, but the quiet nod he gave her steadied her spine more than any word could. And slowly the whispers began to change. The turning point came during the harvest fair. The town gathered, music spilling from fiddles, the air thick with roasted meat and fresh bread. Children ran laughing between wagons. Ribbons fluttered in the breeze. Maggie stood near the edge of the crowd, veil in place, clutching a small loaf she had baked herself. Her heart pounded. She had not dared bring food to a public table in years. When she set it down among the pies and stews, the air grew tense. A man scoffed. A woman sniffed, her hand tightening on her daughter's shoulder. But then Ethan stepped forward. He took the loaf, cut a slice, and ate it in full view of all. He said nothing, only chewed, swallowed, and set the rest back on the table. The gesture was small, but it was enough. Others hesitated, then reached. By dusk, the bread was gone. Maggie sat on a bench as lanterns flickered to life, her hands folded in her lap. The scar on her cheek no longer felt like a brand. Not here, not now. For the first time since stepping off the train, she felt the faint warmth of belonging, fragile, uncertain, but real. Ethan joined her, lowering himself onto the bench without a word. They sat side by side, watching children chase fireflies in the darkening square. After a long silence, Maggie turned, her voice trembling but clear. When Richard Hale turned away, I thought my life was finished. But maybe it was only beginning. Ethan's eyes met hers, steady as ever. Sometimes the wrong door closes, he said, so the right one has room to open. The night hummed around them, alive with music and laughter. Maggie's heart felt lighter than it had in years. The scar was still there, her father's name still whispered, but neither defined her anymore. Not with Ethan at her side. And so the story of the trader's daughter, of the veiled bride who came to Millstone Junction, did not end in shame on a train platform. It began anew in a cabin of pine and firelight, with a man who spoke little but carried much, and a woman who had been broken but refused to stay so. For in the silence between them, something stronger than pity had grown. Something enduring. Something like hope. Help! Maggie's voice tore through the quiet like a whip crack. Lantern light flickered across her face, the scar exposed for all to see, sweat shining along her temple. Her hair had fallen loose, dark strands sticking to her cheeks as she stumbled barefoot across the boards. Her shawl trailed like a ragged wing. Men turned, startled, mugs halfway to their lips. A woman froze on the saloon steps, a basket of bread slipping from her hand. For a moment no one moved. Maggie's chest heaved, each breath jagged, her hands red with Ethan's blood. It's Ethan, he's... Her throat closed on the words. She pointed, trembling, toward the hills. Someone tried to kill him. Silence cracked. Then boots hit the ground. A few men, older, rough-faced ranch hands, threw glances at each other and ran for their horses. Others lingered, whispering, suspicion still sharp on their tongues. But Maggie didn't care who believed her. She seized the arm of the blacksmith, her voice raw, begging, Please, please, he's bleeding. He'll die if we don't." The blacksmith's eyes narrowed, weighing her. Then he spat into the dirt, grabbed a lantern, and barked, "Tom, get the doc. You saddle up." The spell broke. The town lurched into motion. Maggie's knees buckled, but she forced herself upright, her heart battering her ribs. She had spent years shrinking beneath whispers, hiding behind cloth. Tonight she had no veil, no shield, nothing but the raw fire of fear in her chest, and it carried her farther than shame ever could. Back at the cabin, Ethan clung to the edge of consciousness. His hand pressed hard against his side, blood seeping hot between his fingers. The broken door hung crooked, banging in the wind. Shadows danced wild across the walls as the fire sputtered. He thought of Maggie, not as she was when she first stepped off that train, trembling behind lace, but as she had been tonight, her eyes meeting his without flinching, her shoulders trembling yet refusing to bend. He gritted his teeth, muttering through the haze, "Hold on, McJarry. Don't you leave her alone now." His vision blurred. He forced himself upright, revolver still clutched in his other hand, listening for boots in the dirt outside. Another attack. But only the storm wind answered. Minutes later, pounding hooves broke the silence. Lanterns swung in the dark. Maggie returned with the blacksmith, 2 ranch hands, and the town doctor, old Harlan Price, coat half-buttoned, hair sticking wild from sleep. Maggie flew inside first, nearly slipping on the blood-slick boards. "Ethan!" she cried, voice breaking. He raised his head, pale but alive, lips twisting into the faintest shadow of a smile. "Took you long enough," he rasped. The doctor shoved past her, dropping his satchel. "Out of the way. Hold that lantern steady," he barked. Rough hands gripped Maggie's shoulders, guiding her back, but she fought to stay close. Ethan caught her wrist weakly. "Stay," he whispered. She did. The next moments blurred into chaos. Cloth torn into bandages, needle and thread flashing in the lamplight. Ethan's grunts muffled against clenched teeth. Maggie held his free hand, her tears falling fast onto his skin. She whispered his name again and again, as if saying it would tether him to the earth. At last, the bleeding slowed. The doctor wiped his brow, muttering, "Bullet missed the lung. He'll mend, if infection don't take him." Maggie's breath shuddered out. She bowed her head against Ethan's chest, his heartbeat faint but steady beneath her ear. Relief washed over her in a flood so fierce it left her trembling. Outside, the blacksmith stepped onto the porch, voice carrying across the town square. It was Richard Hale's doing. Man can't stand shame, so he sent a killer. Gasps rose in the dark. A few curses followed. And just like that, the whispers shifted again. For the first time since Maggie Doyle set foot in Millstone Junction, they were not aimed at her. They were aimed at him. The morning after the attack, Millstone Junction woke uneasy. The storm had passed, but the air was thick, heavy, as though the prairie itself was holding its breath. By mid-morning, talk of the night's violence had reached every porch and shop front. The story grew with each telling. Some swore 2 men had burst into the cabin. Others said Ethan killed the intruder outright. But one fact no one questioned. Richard Hale's name was in every retelling. At the barber's chair, someone muttered, "Couldn't take the shame, so he sent a knife in the dark." At the general store, another whispered, "A man like that. Money, land, pride. He'll buy his way out, you'll see." The town was split. Some defended him, saying Richard had always been a man of order, a man who gave generously to the church roof fund. Others shook their heads, muttering that no amount of money could clean the stain of cowardice. Maggie listened to none of it. She stayed by Ethan's side, pressing cool cloths to his fevered skin, spooning broth between his lips when he stirred. The cabin smelled of boiled herbs and smoke. Every creak of the boards made her tense, half expecting another attack. Ethan, pale but steady, kept her anchored. "Don't look at the door," he whispered once, his hand finding hers. "Look at me. Just me." And she did. 3 days later, the sheriff came. He was a broad man with a slow walk, hat pulled low against the sun. Dust clung to his coat. He knocked once before stepping into the cabin. "Maggie, Ethan." His voice was even unreadable. "We've taken Richard into custody. Bounty hunter from Laramie's already spoken. Said Hale paid him in full." Maggie froze, fingers tightening on the washcloth she held. "So it's true," she breathed. The sheriff nodded. "We'll try him before the week's out. Some folks'll fight it, but the town's seen enough. He won't walk free." His gaze lingered on Ethan's bandaged side. "You're lucky," she screamed loud enough to wake the dead. "Luckier still you've got grit in you, McGra." When he left, Maggie stood by the door for a long time, her hand on the frame, staring at the horizon where the town sat like a cluster of old bones. "Richard will fall," she said quietly. "And they'll talk. They'll say it was because of me." Ethan shifted, wincing as he sat up against the wall. His eyes, still sharp despite the fever, held hers. Let them talk. Their words aren't yours to carry. Maggie's throat tightened. But they always follow me. My father's shadow. My name. My scar. It never ends. Ethan shook his head. No, Maggie. What follows you is your strength. They see it even if they spit at it. I saw it the day you lifted that veil. She swallowed hard. For the first time, she let his words in without fighting them. The trial came swift. The whole of Millstone Junction crowded the square. The clapboard courthouse loomed over the crowd, its windows thrown open to let the summer heat escape. Inside, Richard Hale stood in his fine brown suit, silver watch chain gleaming, as though he could will himself back into respectability. His eyes, cold and sharp, never left Maggie's face where she stood at the back of the room. Whispers coiled around her like snakes. Some voices pitted, others sneered. But Maggie stood straight, veil absent, scar bared in the morning light. Her hands trembled, but she didn't lower her head. Witnesses spoke. The hired gun from Laramie gave his account, blunt and damning. The sheriff confirmed the payment, the threats. By the time the jury filed back, the verdict was already written in the faces of the townsfolk. Guilty. The word rolled through the room like thunder. Richard's face hardened, jaw clenching, but he said nothing as he was led away. Maggie's breath left her in a slow, shaking exhale. For years, she had been the one whispered about, judged by a name she never chose. But now it was Richard who bore the weight of disgrace. That night, she and Ethan sat by the fire, silence between them deep and easy. His wound still pained him, but his hand found hers across the quilt. Tomorrow, he said softly, they'll find another name to chew on, not ours. Maggie stared into the flames, the orange glow flickering across her scar. For once, it didn't feel like a brand. It felt like a mark of survival. She leaned against his shoulder, her voice steady. Maybe it's time I stop running from mine. Ethan turned slightly, pressing his lips to her temple. It's not Doyle they'll remember, he murmured. It's Maggie. And as the fire cracked and the prairie wind sang low outside, Maggie let herself believe it might be true. Weeks slipped into months. Summer's heat gave way to autumn's gold. The prairie grasses turned brittle, whispering under the wind, while the pines held their dark green steady against the hills. First, Maggie hardly left the cabin. She still felt the weight of eyes whenever she stepped into town, the invisible pull of whispers. But gradually, necessity drew her out. She accompanied Ethan to the mill, to the blacksmith, to the mercantile. Each time, the veil stayed behind on its peg by the door. And though stairs lingered, something was changing. The blacksmith's wife greeted her once, a cautious smile tugging at her mouth. The baker's boy handed her an extra roll when she bought bread. Even the preacher's wife, who had once crossed the street to avoid her, nodded stiffly when their paths met. It wasn't affection, not yet, but it was something new. Respect, perhaps, or at least the recognition that Maggie Doyle had survived where others would have withered. Back at the cabin, life settled into rhythm again. Ethan's wound healed, leaving another scar to join the one at his temple. He worked the land slowly at first, with Maggie walking beside him, steadying his pace, fetching water, learning the patience of soil and seed. In the evenings, they shared stories. Maggie told him of her mother's songs, sung soft while mending clothes by firelight. Ethan told her of his brother, of fishing trips along the river when the world had still been innocent. Sometimes they laughed, sometimes they fell quiet, staring into the flames as if the fire itself could carry their memories into the dark and burn them clean. By the first snow, something had shifted between them that neither needed to name. One night, as wind rattled the shutters, Maggie sat mending a shirt at the table. Ethan leaned against the hearth, watching her, the firelight catching in his eyes. "You've steadied this place," he said finally. "This house was just wood and nails before. Now it feels lived in." Maggie's hands stilled. She looked up, heart quickening. "You think I belong here?" Ethan's gaze did not waver. "You are here. That's belonging enough." Her throat tightened. She set the shirt aside, her scar bright in the glow. I never thought I'd hear someone say that. He crossed the room slowly, knelt by her chair, and took her hand in his. Then let me be the first of many. Her breath caught, but she did not look away. And for the first time in her life, she did not feel like a ghost haunting someone else's story. She felt real, present, wanted. Spring came. Green returned to the prairie. Life sprouted in places long thought barren. The town, too, softened with the season. People no longer spoke only of the scar or the name. They spoke of the bread Maggie sold at the fair, of the neat stitches she offered neighbors when clothes tore, of the calm strength she carried when storms blew hard across the valley. One afternoon, while Ethan traded lumber at the mill, a young girl tugged on Maggie's skirt. Maggie bent down, startled, and the child whispered, "Your bread is the best in town." Maggie smiled through tears she hadn't expected. Years later, Millstone Junction barely remembered the train platform where Richard Hale had turned her away. That story became a cautionary tale of pride, while Maggie's name became tied to something else: resilience, kindness, quiet grace. At the cabin by the pines, smoke still rose from the chimney. Laughter sometimes drifted through the open windows. And at its heart, a scarred woman and a war-worn man built something stronger than either had ever thought possible. Not a life untouched by pain, but a life claimed in spite of it. And that, Maggie realized each time she looked out across the prairie, was more than enough. The morning her mother stepped off the train, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. The platform at Millstone Junction was less crowded than the day Maggie had first arrived, but the stillness was heavier, the looks sharper. Travelers shifted aside, townsfolk lingered, whispering. Her mother was thinner than Maggie remembered, her frame bent beneath the weight of years and grief. A faded shawl clung to her shoulders, worn lace gloves covering hands that trembled as they clutched a carpetbag. Strands of gray streaked through her dark hair, pinned hastily beneath a bonnet. "Mama," Maggie whispered, frozen at the edge of the platform. The older woman lifted her face and her eyes, still the same soft hazel Maggie had once known, brightened with relief, then clouded with shame. "Margaret!" Her voice broke. Maggie rushed forward, catching her mother's frail form in her arms. For a moment, the years melted, and she was a child again, clinging to the only anchor she'd ever had. But as she pulled back, she saw it, fear darting in her mother's eyes, a fear not of reunion, but of being seen. Richard Hale stepped forward then, boots striking the platform like gunshots. His suit was pressed, his hat shadowing eyes that gleamed with cold satisfaction. "Mrs. Doyle," he said smoothly, "your daughter has been in need of guidance. It is time we correct the course she's taken." Maggie stiffened, pulling her mother closer. "You will not touch her," she said, her voice low but steady. Richard's lips twisted. "You mistake me. I offer protection. A Doyle has no place making house with a drifter, sullying what's left of her name. She belongs where her dignity can be restored." His gaze slid over Maggie, not with admiration, but with ownership, with calculation. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some nodded uneasily, others frowned, but none dared challenge him openly. Maggie's mother trembled, clutching her hand tighter. "Child, maybe he is right. Maybe this is the only way the world will leave you in peace." Maggie's throat burned, but she did not waver. She remembered the silence in the cabin as Ethan slept, the bread left on the porch by neighbors, the laughter in the rain. She remembered the look in Ethan's eyes when he told her she was still Maggie. And for the first time, she did not feel like a shadow of her father's sins. "No, Mama," she said firmly. "Peace does not come from chains. Not from a man who would rather bury me than see me stand." Richard's jaw clenched, the vein in his temple pulsing. He had expected tears, capitulation, perhaps even gratitude. He had not expected defiance. "You think this town will defend you?" he spat, voice rising. "You think that mule driver can keep you safe? You're a Doyle. That name will rot you from the inside out, and every last one of them knows it." But the crowd was not jeering. They were not spitting. They were watching her stand, watching her refuse. From the back of the platform, a voice rang out. She has stood before, Hale. Stood when you turned your back on her like a coward. It was the blacksmith, broad arms crossed, eyes hard. Another voice followed. She nursed McGRA through death's door when you would have left him to bleed. A ranch hand stepped forward. Richard's eyes darted between them, disbelief sharpening into rage. The control he had wielded so easily for years was slipping, thread by thread. Maggie felt her mother's grip tighten, but this time she covered her mother's hand with her own, steadying it. Her voice carried across the platform, strong and clear. I belong where I am seen, and I will not hide again. Richard's mouth tightened, his face a mask of composure cracked by fury underneath. He tipped his hat low, his voice turning cold and deliberate. You speak bold, Margaret, but bold words don't last when the nights grow long and men come calling. That drifter of yours, he won't stand when I decide to take what's mine. The words hit like a slap. The crowd stirred uneasily, boots scuffing against the wooden boards, eyes darting between Maggie and Richard. Before Maggie could answer, a shadow moved at the edge of the platform. Ethan. He walked with a stiff limp, the wound from weeks before still healing, but his presence carried weight. His hat was tipped back, his eyes steady, jaw firm. A faint scar on his temple caught the light, but it was the silence around him that demanded attention. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. You had your chance, Hale, Ethan said, each word low and carved from stone. On that platform when she first stepped off that train, you judged her, shamed her, and left her standing in the dust. You don't get to claim her now. Richard barked a laugh, harsh and brittle. Claim? You think this is about love, McGRA? This is about name, about standing. You wouldn't understand. Men like you never do. Ethan took another step forward, the limp slowing him but not stopping him. You're right. I don't understand a man who mistakes pride for worth or ownership for love. His eyes narrowed, voice firm. But I do understand what it means to fight for someone who makes the world worth the fight. Maggie's chest tightened. She could feel her mother trembling beside her, hear the soft murmurs spreading through the crowd. Whispers not of scorn this time, but of agreement, of awakening. Richard's gaze flicked across the faces. Neighbors, ranchers, wives, men who once laughed at his jokes, followed his lead. Now their eyes lingered on Maggie, then back on him, and he saw it, doubt. His hands curled into fists. You'll regret this, he spat, his voice cracking with restrained rage. Every last one of you. Then he turned sharply, boots hammering against the boards as he stormed down the platform, mounting his horse in one fluid motion. Dust rose in his wake, but the echo of his threat hung heavy in the air. For a long moment no one moved. The train hissed in the background, steam curling like ghostly fingers through the silence. Maggie let out a slow breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her hand slid from her mother's trembling grasp to Ethan's arm. His muscles were taut beneath her touch, but when he looked at her, his eyes softened. You shouldn't have come, she whispered, voice breaking with worry. And let him stand alone against you? Ethan said quietly. Never. The crowd slowly began to disperse, but something lingered in their faces, in the way they nodded to Ethan, in the way they didn't turn from Maggie this time. It wasn't pity. It wasn't scorn. It was acknowledgement, respect. Her mother's voice broke the silence. Margaret, I thought the world would crush you. I see now you've found a place where it cannot. Maggie swallowed, her throat tight. She looked at Ethan, then back at her mother. I found someone who saw me when no one else would. That night, the cabin felt smaller, the walls tighter, as though Richard's shadow still pressed against the door. Ethan sat by the fire, cleaning his revolver with steady hands. Maggie moved quietly, pouring tea, though her fingers trembled. You think he'll come back, she said softly. Ethan didn't look up. Not think. No. The flames crackled, casting long shadows across the walls. Maggie wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders. Her heart pounded with dread, but beneath it was something steadier, stronger. A flame she hadn't known she carried. She would not run this time. If Richard came, he would find not a girl on a train platform, trembling beneath a veil, but a woman who had stood in the storm and learned to stand taller. Smoke swirled thick across the yard, curling black against the gray dawn. Sparks spat from the burning feed stall, raining down like fiery hail on the churned dirt. The horses screamed and kicked, their panic filling the air with chaos. Men coughed and cursed, shadows flickering in and out of the smoke like devils in the mist. Maggie's heart slammed against her ribs as she crouched over Ethan. His blood seeped hot and fast between her fingers, staining her palms a deep red. His face was pale, lips tight with pain, but his eyes were sharp, defiant, fixed on Richard Hale. Richard staggered in the dirt, clutching his wounded shoulder. His once pristine coat was torn, smeared with blood and dust. The sneer still clung to his lips, but it was twisted now, desperate, trembling beneath the weight of smoke and failure. He spat into the ground, voice ragged with rage. "You'll regret this, McGra. You and that scarred witch both." The words cracked through the smoke, cruel and venomous. Maggie's breath caught, but before she could answer, Ethan pushed himself upright, teeth clenched against the pain. He braced on one knee, revolver still steady in his shaking hand. "Call her that again," Ethan rasped, "and you'll never speak another word." Silence fell thick, heavy, suffocating. The only sound was the crackle of the flames and the frantic whinnying of the horses. Richard's men shifted uneasily, glancing at one another, their confidence broken. One dropped his rifle. Another kicked his horse backward, retreating into the smoke. For the first time, Richard looked smaller. His fury no longer commanded the yard. It flailed there, burning away like the hay in the stalls. His men were slipping from him, loyalty unraveling strand by strand. Maggie tightened her arms around Ethan, feeling the tremor in his muscles, the heat of his blood against her skin. Her own voice broke through the smoke, strong though tears burned her eyes. "You think shame is stronger than love, Richard?" she shouted. "But look around you. You've lost. You lost the moment you left me on that platform." Richard's face twisted, but no words came. He turned, dragging himself into his saddle with his one good arm. His horse reared, spooked by the fire, and carried him stumbling into the haze. His remaining men followed, vanishing like ghosts into the prairie. The yard fell quiet except for the fire snapping at the feed stall and Ethan's ragged breathing. Maggie pressed her forehead to his, tears streaming freely now, her voice trembling. "Stay with me, Ethan. Please, stay." He coughed, lips curving into the faintest shadow of a smile. "I told you, you were worth fighting for." Maggie's sob turned into something fierce, something steady. She pulled him tighter against her, shielding him from the smoke, refusing to let go. Around them, the fire began to die, beaten down by the wind and the wet earth, leaving the cabin yard blackened but standing. And there, in the ashes, a truth had been forged. Ethan had fought not just for her survival, but for her right to live unchained. And Maggie, with blood on her hands and fire in her eyes, knew she would fight for him too, for as long as breath remained in her body. The fire smoldered into damp smoke, curling low across the scorched yard. The sun pushed higher, its light pale and uncertain through the haze. Maggie's hands shook as she pressed cloth harder against Ethan's side, her tears dripping into the blood-stained fabric. His breaths were shallow, uneven, but steady enough to cling to hope. The door of the cabin burst open. Daniel stumbled out, wide-eyed, his young face pale with fear. Behind him came Maggie's mother, her voice breaking. "Margaret, oh Lord, don't!" Maggie snapped, sharper than she meant. But her hands were slick, her heart in her throat. "Don't cry now. Help me." Her mother dropped to her knees beside them, hands fumbling for the clean rags they had brought from town. Daniel, trembling but determined, darted back inside, reappearing moments later with a basin of water and strips of torn sheet. Together they worked. Maggie's hands were steady now, her tears drying into resolve. She cleaned, pressed, bound. whispered to Ethan when his eyes fluttered shut. "You stay awake, Ethan McGra," she whispered fiercely. "You hear me? You don't get to leave me, not after everything." By mid-morning, the flames were gone, leaving behind only smoke, charred boards, and the acrid stench of burned hay. The cabin stood, scarred but unbroken, and so did they. Word traveled fast, carried by the riders who had fled, by the smoke rising over the prairie. By noon, townsfolk began to appear on the road, hesitant at first, then in twos and threes, gathering at the fence line. Maggie saw them from the porch where she sat cradling Ethan's head against her lap. Faces she once feared now watched her not with scorn but with awe. The blacksmith stepped forward first, hat in hand, voice low. "We saw the smoke. Need help with the roof." Behind him, the baker's wife lifted a basket. "Brought bread and broth. He'll need strength." More voices followed. "Got timber for rebuilding. My boy can mend the stall. Tell us what you need, Maggie." Maggie blinked, tears stinging her eyes again, but not from shame. She looked down at Ethan, unconscious but breathing, then back at the crowd. For the first time in her life, the weight of her name lifted. She wasn't just Doyle's daughter anymore. She was Maggie. Maggie who had stood, who had fought, who had loved. That night, lanterns glowed across the yard as neighbors worked. Daniel fetched water, his boyish face set with new determination. Maggie's mother sat by Ethan's side, praying softly, but Maggie herself moved like a flame through the dark, directing, tending, thanking, strong. By dawn, the cabin stood patched, the stall secured, the fences shored up. The townsfolk left quietly, their respect shown not in words but in the labor of their hands. When the last hammer fell silent, Maggie returned to Ethan's side. His color was better now, his fever easing. She brushed a damp lock of hair from his brow and whispered, "You'll wake and find it different. This place, this life, it's ours now. No one can take it." As the prairie stretched into another day, Maggie finally understood. Scars did not mark the end of her story. They were proof she had survived it. And beside Ethan, through fire and fury, she had finally found not just survival, but home. His voice was thin, almost lost beneath the crackle of dying embers and the hushed murmurs of the crowd. Maggie bent closer, her tears falling onto his hand as she held it against her scarred cheek. "No one ever told you," Ethan whispered again, fighting for breath, his lips trembling. His eyes searched hers, unfocused yet burning with a fragile light. "No one ever told you, you're beautiful." The words cracked something open inside her. She pressed her forehead to his hand, sobbing softly, not from shame, but from the release of years of silence, of carrying a wound heavier than her scar. For so long she had hidden, had believed the whispers, the pointed fingers, the cruel laughter. But here, in front of them all, the truth came from the only man who had ever seen her. Not the scar, not the name, but her. The old woman beside them pressed firmer with the cloth, muttering to herself as if scolding the wound. "He's strong," she said aloud, her voice cutting through the quiet. "He'll hold. He just needs time." Time. That was all Maggie wanted. Just more of it. More days of silence shared by firelight. More mornings with bread and honey on the table. More laughter in the tall grass. She tightened her grip on Ethan's hand, willing him to stay tethered to this world. Around them, the crowd shifted. The rancher who had once spat near her boots now stepped forward, clearing his throat. "We'll rebuild the stall," he said. "No charge. Man who fights like this for a woman deserves a roof that holds." The blacksmith nodded gruffly. "And I'll mend the tools. Got no use for coin in this matter." A young mother stepped closer, a basket of herbs and cloth in her hands. "Take this. For his fever. For the pain." Her voice was shy but sure. One by one, the town moved, their silence breaking not into gossip, but into offerings. Timber, blankets, water, food. No longer was Maggie Doyle the daughter of a trader. No longer was she the scarred bride left on a platform. She was the woman who had stood in fire and blood and love, and endured. Maggie lifted her face at last, streaked with soot and tears, veil gone forever. She met their eyes without flinching. They didn't look away. Some nodded. Some smiled faintly. All stayed. Daniel, clutching her skirt still, looked up at her with wide, reverent eyes. For the first time, he did not look at her as his broken sister, but as something stronger, someone who could not be bent by shame. Ethan stirred again, groaning softly, dragging her attention back to him. His eyes fluttered. "Still here," he murmured. Maggie kissed his hand, fierce and trembling. "You stay. You hear me? You stay. You're my home." The dawn light grew stronger, washing the ash-streaked yard in gold. Richard's name was already fading into hushed tones, a shadow slipping into history. But Maggie and Ethan, scarred, bloodied, and bound together, remained in the center of it all, surrounded not by scorn, but by a town that had finally begun to see them as they truly were. The final confrontation was over. Love had endured, and in that enduring, Maggie had won something greater than survival. She had won her place. The days that followed moved slowly, stitched together by care and exhaustion. Ethan drifted in and out of sleep, fever clinging to him like a shadow. Maggie barely left his side. She slept in a chair beside the bed, her head resting on the edge of the mattress, waking at the faintest stir of his breath. When he cried out in the night, she was there. When he reached weakly for water, she held the cup to his lips. And when his pain pulled him into silence, she simply held his hand, her thumb moving back and forth across his knuckles, reminding him he was not alone. The town did not abandon them. Each day someone came, sometimes with bread, sometimes with milk, sometimes only with quiet company. The blacksmith fixed the door that had been broken down in the attack. The rancher's boys raised new beams where fire had chewed the barn. Even children helped, bringing buckets of water and laughter that made the place feel less heavy. Maggie did not wear her veil again. Not once. At first it startled her to feel the sun warm her bare cheek, or to walk past someone and know they could see every line of her scar. But no one looked at her the way they used to. When she met their eyes, they met hers. And slowly, the weight of years began to fall from her shoulders. Weeks passed before Ethan could stand on his own again. He leaned heavy on a cane, his steps uneven, but his spirit unshaken. One morning, Maggie found him outside, standing beneath the cottonwoods, staring at the sky. She rushed to his side, scolding him for leaving the bed. But he only smiled, tired but certain. "I need to see the horizon again," he said. "To remind myself I'm still here." She slipped her arm through his, steadying him. "You are," she whispered. "And you're not leaving me now." The scar on her face caught the sunlight, but for the first time in years, she did not turn away. As spring deepened, life returned to the land. Maggie planted beans and cabbage with Daniel at her side. Ethan, slower but stubborn, worked with the rancher's men to rebuild the fences. Evenings were filled with simple joys, warm bread, quiet talk, the crackle of firewood. The town began to change too. Where once Maggie had been met with whispers and sidelong glances, now she was greeted with nods, with words spoken plain. At the market, women included her in their conversations. Men offered fair prices. Children waved. It wasn't instant, and it wasn't perfect, but the tide had turned. Richard Hale did not return. Word came that he had sold his ranch in Laramie and left the territory, his name sour in every mouth. Some said he limped when he rode away, a shoulder ruined by the bullet Ethan had given him. Others said he would never dare show his face in Wyoming again. For Maggie, it did not matter. His power over her was broken. One warm evening, when the sky was streaked with violet and gold, Ethan sat with Maggie on the porch. Daniel had gone inside, and her mother was already asleep. The air smelled of lilac and fresh earth. Ethan reached for her hand. "You know," he said quietly, "I never thought I'd have this again. A home, a reason. You gave it to me." Maggie turned to him, her eyes soft in the twilight. "And you gave me something I thought I'd lost forever." "What's that?" he asked. "Dignity," she said. Then, after a pause, "And love." He smiled, slow and steady, and leaned his forehead against hers. "Then we're even." They sat that way for a long time, the prairie stretching out endless before them, the world carrying on. Maggie no longer felt like she was holding herself together with scraps of hope and threadbare courage. She felt whole. And when the wind shifted, carrying the laughter of Daniel inside the cabin, she realized something else. This was not just survival. This was a beginning. Summer came, hot and dry, but the land thrived under their hands. The garden Maggie planted grew tall with beans, onions, potatoes, and squash. Ethan, though still healing, worked alongside her, leaning on his cane when his strength gave out. Daniel proved himself quick with the horses, his nervous eyes hardening into the steady gaze of a young man. By autumn, the harvest was rich. For the first time in years, Maggie did not worry about the coming winter. She stood in the field one evening, dirt on her hands, sweat on her brow, and realized she was not afraid anymore. The town began to see her differently. At church gatherings, she was welcomed with a place at the table. Women who once whispered now asked her for recipes, for advice on sewing, for help when their children were sick. Maggie never sought to lead, but people turned to her, drawn by her quiet resilience. It was Daniel who first spoke what everyone else had begun to think. One evening, as the fire crackled low, he looked across the table at Ethan and said, "You should marry my sister." Maggie nearly dropped her spoon. Ethan's lips twitched into a smile, but his eyes stayed steady on hers. He didn't laugh it away. He didn't tease. He simply said, "When she's ready, I'll ask." Her cheeks burned, but her heart swelled. For the first time, the thought of marriage did not feel like a cage. Felt like freedom. The winter that followed was brutal. Snow piled high against the cabin walls, and wind howled through the cracks. But they endured it together. Nights were long, but the fire burned bright, and their laughter filled the dark. Maggie learned to trust the warmth in Ethan's eyes, to lean on it, to believe it would not fade. When spring returned, the town held a gathering, a barn dance to celebrate the thaw. Maggie had not danced since she was a child. But when Ethan held out his hand, she took it. They moved slow, careful, her head resting against his chest. The scar on her cheek caught the lantern light, but she no longer thought of it. All she felt was the steady beat of his heart under her palm. That night, as they walked home under a blanket of stars, Ethan stopped at the edge of the field. He turned to her, his face lit by moonlight. "Maggie," he said, voice low but certain, "I've waited as long as I can. Will you marry me?" Her breath caught. Tears stung her eyes. She didn't answer with words. She simply stepped forward and kissed him, soft and sure. The wedding was small, held beneath the cottonwoods that had once sheltered their fear and now bore witness to their hope. The town came, not out of duty, but out of respect. The blacksmith stood as witness. The rancher's wife baked the bread. Children wove wildflowers into Maggie's hair. She did not wear a veil. She never would again. Years passed and the little farm grew. Chickens scratched in the yard, fruit trees lined the fence, and laughter filled the home. Maggie bore 2 children, a girl with Ethan's calm eyes and a boy with her wild spirit. Daniel grew tall, strong, and left to make his own way, but always returned each harvest to help. And in the town's memory, Maggie became more than her father's daughter, more than the scar on her face. She became the woman who stood in the street and begged for help, and in doing so, changed the heart of Millstone Junction forever. Ethan's hair silvered, his steps slowed, but his eyes never wavered from her. On quiet evenings, they still sat on the porch, side by side, watching the prairie stretch out beneath the setting sun. "You saved me," she would whisper sometimes. "No," he would answer, his voice as steady as it had ever been. "You saved me." And the truth was they had saved each other. His thumb brushed gently over the scar on her cheek. Rough skin against hers, tender in a way she had never known. "You're beautiful," Ethan whispered. The words hit her like a strike to the chest. Her breath caught and then the sob broke free. It shook through her ribs, her shoulders, her whole body, and she no longer tried to hide it. Tears spilled down her face, hot and endless, soaking into his shirt, sliding down his neck, dropping into the dirt beneath them as if the earth itself needed to drink this truth. She lowered her forehead to his, pressing against him like she could hold his life inside her by will alone. "You came for me," he breathed, voice ragged, each word costly. "And I always will," she answered. No hesitation, no fear, just a promise spoken from the deepest part of her. Around them, silence held like a sacred shroud. No one dared move, no one dared break the spell. The people who had once mocked her stood as if they were witnesses to something larger than themselves. Not a fight, not a scandal, but a covenant. Daniel stepped forward, his face pale, lips pressed tight. For years, he had watched his sister bend under weight she never asked to carry. Now he saw her kneel in the dust, not broken, but alive with love. He said nothing, but the look in his eyes was enough. Respect, pride, and something close to awe. The old woman, the same one who had pressed a cloth to Ethan's wound, touched Maggie's shoulder. Her hand was light, but her voice was steady. "He needs a doctor again. We can bring him." Maggie lifted her tear-streaked face, nodded once, and wiped her cheeks with the back of her hand. Her voice shook, but it carried. "Help me lift him." Together, Maggie and Daniel bore his weight, step by step, with the townsfolk steadying where they faltered. Into the cabin they went. A cabin half-charred, still smelling of smoke and scorched wood, but also of something older, something harder to name. Hope. Over the next 2 days, the town came and went. Women brought linens, broth, herbs, even sugar wrapped in brown paper. Men hammered new planks into the fence, patched the barn, and left without a word. The doctor rode in twice, leaving bandages and stern warnings. No one asked about Maggie's name. No one demanded apology. What mattered had already been witnessed in the firelight and the fight. Ethan lived. Barely, but he lived. When the fever broke, when the stitches held and the color crept back into his cheeks, he stood on shaky legs in the doorway of that same cabin. His body thin, scarred, but alive. Maggie stood across the room, holding a basin of water, her veil long forgotten, her scar bare in the daylight. He watched her for a long while. Then he said, with a voice low but sure, "I want to leave this place." Maggie froze. For years, the word leave had meant shame, running, hiding. But his eyes told her it wasn't escape he sought. It was freedom. She set the basin down. Her throat tightened. Then she whispered, "Take me with you." He did. They sold the cabin to a young couple expecting their first child. They packed what little they owned. A trunk, some tools, a quilt that still smelled of smoke, and they hitched the wagon west, past the river, past the ridge, toward Oregon, where the land was wide and the past was far behind. They did not look back. But the town remembered. For years afterward, whispers lingered in Millstone Junction. People spoke of the scarred woman who stood unflinching in the fire, of the quiet man who fought, not just for her hand, but for her right to stand whole, and of the dawn when smoke still clung to the rooftops, and something like grace passed through the streets and stayed behind. Children grew up hearing her name, not as a curse, but as a legend. Maggie Doyle, the daughter of a trader, the woman who carried fire in her chest and love in her hands. And when, many years later, a child asked why Maggie never wore a veil, Ethan would only smile. He would take her hand, rough against his, and answer gently, "Because she has nothing left to hide." He would glance at her then, eyes soft, and add, "Love made her beautiful, and now everyone knows it." The story of Maggie and Ethan was never written in books. It lived in the memory of those who saw it unfold. A reminder that even in the dust, even in disgrace, love can rise and turn the cruelest scar into something holy. And if this story touched your heart, if it made you believe that love can still rise from dust, danger, and disgrace, then don't forget to hit that hype button and let us know you're out there riding with us. Because sometimes the truest tales aren't about heroes or outlaws. They're about people who chose each other when the world said they shouldn't. And those are the stories worth keeping alive. And if you want more love stories like this set in the raw beauty of the American frontier, where scars are worn, with pride and hearts fight harder than fists, then subscribe to Legends of Love Stories and saddle up for the next ride. Until then, may your heart be brave, your spirit be free, and your story worth remembering you down the trail.